please.
Thank you. I've planted my own sound checker in the audience, so Emma, thank you. First of all, thank you. First of all, I'm immensely grateful to the organisers for inviting me to participate in this conference. It's my first ERD conference, and it certainly won't be my last. I'm currently based at the University of Melbourne because I'm on a research sabbatical after spending 3 years as director of the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester. And of course, after those 3 years as being director, I had lots of sort of plans about the writing and the research that I was going to do on my sabbatical. But my plans changed because I got absolutely obsessed in telling a different story. Because just before I left to go to Melbourne, I was going through my father's things, clearing out his house in India. And I came across this old briefcase. It was locked with no key, but of course in India, as in many other places, that doesn't make a difference. You can always find somebody who will not ask any questions and open it for you. And inside were 6 photographs. There's 4 of them that I've put up here. My mother with her first camera, my parents in their first flat in London in the 1960s, my father at some sort of business lunch, and at the top right, my parents on holiday somewhere. And alongside those 4 photographs were 2 exercise books, old Indian school exercise books. And in the front pages on the left-hand side here was a travelogue which detailed dates, places left and arrived at, the amount of petrol in the tank, the date and the time. And in the back pages on the right here were their accounts. And as it transpired, in 1955, my parents took the steamer from Bombay to Southampton, travelled up to London, bought a Morris Oxford car, and spent the next 6 months travelling back to India. They first drove through Britain, visiting iconic sites that had fueled their imagination during their education under British colonial rule in India. They went to Stratford-upon-Avon, where they paid 9 shillings to see Macbeth at the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre, because, of course, they pored over the Longman poetry reader when they were at school. Now, they were anti-colonial nationalists, but they dreamt of visiting Britain, the ambivalence, of course, of colonialism. So as I embarked on my first attempt to try and make scholarly what had for a long time just been an extraordinary family story, I began to bring together 2 academic fields of study that have preoccupied my own work over the last 30 years in development: the study of migration, the movement of people and mobility, and the history and the legacy of colonialism in the present. And I became aware that actually my parents' story was one of post-colonial networks. It was a form of post-colonial solidarity, which I hope that I have time at the end to give an example of, drawn from their accounts. And I reflected, in a sense, on how development discourse, thinking, policy, and practice has embedded particular spatial, historical, moral, ideological, political demarcations in such a way that it's constrained the forging of solidarity. And I want to think about this in the context of refugees and refuginess, and specifically to examine it in the context of where is the theorizing around solidarity, where is the practice of solidarity within Western studies of development, because surely that is foundational to what development is about. And I think this requires a much more effective endeavour to forge practices of care for others based on mutual recognition and shared responsibility rather than the magnanimous gestures towards distant others. And I think part of the problem here is that there remains a taken for granted assumption that development interventions exemplify solidarity, because after all, development interventions, aren't they founded on ideas about universal rights and an ethics of care? However, the persistence, I think, of dominant narratives that homogenize and dehumanize refugees reveal the inadequacy of development thinking to understand and to challenge these representations and to instill some kind of solidaristic principle. Because solidarity can't be merely invoked or forged at distinct critical moments, but rather emerge over time in everyday contexts and in everyday spaces, as Katharina has identified. In this context, then, how might development promote and sustain new forms of solidarity that work towards achieving global social justice? So what I want to do is to start off by looking at that process of dehumanization and then look at some of the constraints within development for how we find ourselves limited in forging solidaristic principles and ways of moving towards that kind of everyday humanitarianism, and then look at some of the ways forward. And if I have time, I'd like to return to my parents' story to look at a form of post-colonial solidarity. Yesterday afternoon, Katrina and I received an email saying we had to cut our talk down by 5 minutes. So I've adopted a two-pronged strategy. I have taken out a few paragraphs, and now I'm going to speak very, very quickly. In 1968, Hannah Arendt wrote that we should retain the aspiration to strive for a world in common. She argues that during World War II, refugees were seen as superfluous people. So what did she mean by that? Well, she meant that mobile people had no state and no citizenship rights, right? But they also had no visibility. That is, that they couldn't appear to act or speak in public. They had no agency or agentive presence. So they were removed from the public and political sphere, and all they had was their biological lives, right? Their bodies, that they could live or die. Ultimately, she wrote, we can see that they are human, but they're not humanized. And today, as we witness the humanitarian catastrophe of our generation, how have we come to be just so inhumane all over again? And while many of us here thoroughly reject how those fleeing persecution and violence are being constituted in politicized discourses and the way in which they're being publicly represented, nonetheless, our perceptions and understandings continue to be shaped by, or indeed are in reaction to, a public discourse that dehumanizes but also distances the other. As Silverstone notes, distance is not just a material, a geographical, or even a social category, it's a moral category. Because in the media, we sometimes push others to a point beyond strangeness, beyond humanity, where they become dehumanized and demonized. So over the last few decades, we've effectively normalized the previously unacceptable through the construction of a notion of refugeeness that sits within complex discursive ideas of security and threat, compassion and hospitality, with refugees predominantly framed as either helpless victims or objects of fear. And this seriously affects how refugees are publicly perceived, the ways in which they're received, and the ways in which they're welcomed. And people rely very heavily on media accounts for their knowledge beliefs, for their knowledge, their beliefs and opinions. And all of that, I think, hinders the possibility of a sort of form of transnational solidarity. So 2015 was indeed the year of the most highly publicized and mediatized representations of refugees and the movement of people. So the dehumanizing that Arendt talked about is placed in an ever more extensive and immediate medium. And this works to generate powerful and often negative connotations that vilify refugees, instill fear and hatred, but simultaneously have led to the outpouring of compassion and acts of kindness that we've witnessed. Now, in times of social and political upheaval, cultural shifts and economic instability, solidarity was defined in a sense as the willingness to share and redistribute material and immaterial resources, drawing on feelings of shared fate and vision, group loyalty, and collective action. And one of the most profound and widespread developments in the context of refugees today has been a visual language of welcome. Although it might be easier, of course, to welcome others than to live amongst them. But perhaps there's a potential for the welcome to be political and for welcoming to have multiple, unintended, long-lasting, even generational effects. And we begin to get different kinds of accounts, different kinds of representations from artists and poets. And here we have Banksy's The Floating Corpses that resonates with the European flag, and a poem by Wasan Shai, trying to respond to the ways in which people have argued that, why are you getting in a boat when you know that you're likely to drown, an overcrowded boat when you're likely to drown? And she says, you have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. So Judith Butler says that perhaps what we need to think about is we need an innovative conceptualization of solidarity that's based on the notion of shared embodied experience. And in Notes Towards a Performative Theory of Assembly in 2015, she argues that the very fact of people gathering says something without always relying on speech. Protesters, she says, make manifest the understanding that a situation is shared. Now, of course, in development, when you may not have the shared embodied experience, because we're talking about perhaps distant strangers and people who are geographically removed, we need to think about other forms of solidarity. So how is this shaping our own discipline? Edward Said says, as academics, we have an important role to play. Underlying every interpretation of other cultures is the choice facing the individual scholar or intellectual, whether to put intellect at the service of power or at the service of criticism, communities, and moral sense. We in development studies, I think, are positioned at a very critical moment, one that's replete with potential to shape the future through new forms of solidarity and to nurture everyday humanitarianism, to be political. And this is increasingly important, as Ticktin argues, in a world where borders of the global north are zealously guarded and inequality between the north and south is growing. Immigrants and refugees become some of the key populations served by humanitarians, and Katrina has explained that very well, I think. Perhaps you might say, but development is, of course, inherently solidaristic. Key elements of development theory and practice and the mission of international NGOs, such as ideas about universal rights, are structured around ideals and principles that are replete with notions of humanitarianism and with ideas around solidarity. But there is, in fact, a taken for granted, I think, humanitarianism that's assumed in our north-south connections and our ethos of care for distant strangers, our global institutions and our experts, our proclaimed commitments to universal justice and rights. Surely then we are already solidaristic, we're already humanitarian. But remember, colonialism was itself justified through tales of universalism and in defense of humanism. And this is taken from the Empire Marketing Board posters, the colonial government's posters from 1926 to 1933. And here is an early representation, in fact, of that kind of supposed humanism and the superiority of certain groups of people who are justified in intervening in the lives of others. Well, no, I don't think that development is inherently solidaristic, and I don't think that we should carry on assuming that it is necessarily humanitarian. I think solidarity is limited and constrained in development for 5 key reasons. First of all, there's been an increase in academic research on refugees and humanitarianism, but much research continues to invoke and reproduce colonial imaginaries. Here we have a French colonial Christmas card, which was sent written on the body is your colonized identity. We have made many advances in our thinking about development, partly due to post-colonial and feminist critiques. But one area I think that continues to bedevil our attempts at achieving social justice is the continuing racialization of humanitarian ideas and practices that mean that we're unable to see others as our contemporaries. Fundamentally, they are just too different. Secondly, there's an iconography of famine, of poverty. Foundational to mainstream development, I think, is the need to reaffirm difference and distance for all our arguments for bringing people closer together and a common humanity. I think development is actually founded on reinforcing dualisms and dichotomies, because it's that justifies the intervention of some people into the lives of others. And so we embed those dualisms between rich and poor, donors and beneficiaries, West and the rest, us and them. And there's the inherent power then of the development industry to translate and represent other people in a very narrow repertoire of tropes. And we all use this language. This isn't a critique of any individual, but I've heard it in the conference today. I read about it in development journals. People talk about locals or indigenous knowledge. And what that does is reify people as embedded in place, and it abstracts them from the global. So the expert has global knowledge, but the local always only has indigenous knowledge. And by doing that, we reify that distinction and that dichotomy. Through new discourses of partnerships and co-production of knowledge that we see in the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, we are, in a sense, creating perhaps a facade of commonality by using the terms partnership and co-production of knowledge. And I could say a lot more about that, but I don't have time. There's also been a tendency to homogenize the other, to label, for example, everyone who moves under certain conditions. Immediately they move, they become refugees. And as Peter Gatrell writes, we discard as unimportant the life they lived hitherto. Thirdly, there's an emergence of neoliberal forms of solidarity. In The Ironic Spectator, Solidarity in the Age of Post-Humanitarianism, Lily Churiaki provides a very convincing argument for international development scholars to consider how important communication is. She mounts a critique of three transformations that have brought about pragmatism, privatism, and self-gratification. A public discourse of solidarity, she argues, has shifted towards cool capitalism and a neoliberal conception of humanitarianism that replaces conviction with consumption. There you have Bono advertising Louis Vuitton in a sort of stereotypical African savannah. Fourthly, the policy and impact-driven research. These are, to remind you, I'm on the fourth of explaining why I think that we are constrained in development in forging some kind of solidarity. This is George Osborne, who was the Chancellor, the Exchequer under Cameron, and now editor of the London Evening Standard. To me, that says it all. So it's not new to remark on the policy and impact-driven research, but I think it's a useful reminder that aid and development has become instrumentalized. And the changing nature of academia, especially in development where we chase funding, policy implications, end users. I've always wondered, what is an end user? You know, where does it stop? And impact are constraining us. And the Sustainable Development Goals, even though I don't want to be overcritical about them, but they shift our gaze in a way, and prevent us, in a sense, from, as Churiaki says, that the scholarly field of development studies produces administrative policy rather than critical political theory. And fifthly, the new actors and agents. Already in 1995, in his excellent book, The Power of Development, Jonathan Crush noted how the development machine had not only expanded at a phenomenal rate since the 1940s, but alongside that, the discipline had become politically diverse, with liberal and conservative strands constituting conflicting intellectual currents. There's now, of course, a whole range of new and different development actors involved in a variety of ways in the industry. And in development studies, I think we need to consider this very seriously. Increasingly important, of course, is the general Western public. Consumers through fair trade, for example, those who give to charity, attend musical events, those who are involved in producing and circulating the plethora of public media and consumer campaigns. So development is actually in the everyday, in the mundane. It's truly all-encompassing. Where does development begin? Where does it end? So what does this mean then for development studies? Well, I suggest, and perhaps not surprising to some of you, that we need to re-engage with post-colonial critiques. Post-colonialism challenged the power of development to crudely ascribe particular characteristics to different societies, and has attempted to resist the variety of ways in which the West produces knowledge about other people and places. But that's not enough. I think we need to move beyond post-colonial critique to actually thinking what we might move into, what space might we create. And there are three areas where I think this might be possible. The first is rethinking the spatial and geographical in development studies. The second is to rethink the temporal and historical. And the third is the ideological and political demarcations of development. And just a few notes on each of those. In terms of the spatial and the geographical, many people have argued that the old north-south divide that historically enabled the existence of the discipline is outdated. It doesn't reflect today's multipolar world. Large-scale transnational movements, detention, resettlement of people fleeing violence and persecution emphasizes, in a sense, this shift. And this complicates the idea of what we mean by proximate and distant in terms of solidarity, at least spatially. So has solidarity changed because the people over there are now here? Well, of course, the people over there have always, in a sense, been here. So the question is, will a new geography of development open up possibilities for new forms of solidarity to emerge? And I think that's something that we could consider in development studies. Secondly, temporal, the significance of history. New geographies have to be accompanied by new histories. The future orientation of development closes off certain options to deal with the past and past injustices. We're always obsessed with targets and goals and the future orientation. And open any development textbook and it starts with Truman's speech or in 1945. And what that does is conceal a colonial genealogy of development. Tronto argues that conceiving of the past as irrelevant has devastating consequences for our concerns for justice. I don't think we should be historically deterministic, but I think that forgetting past injustices may be used as a way of invoking contemporary agency. But the structures and limitations of the past continue to shape that agency. It leaves no room for remedying past injustices or for moving towards a responsible accountability. And Nina Glick-Schiller writes that historical reflexivity has become curiously lost in recent writings about migration. I think history can help us find and create new possibilities of solidarity. And thirdly, the ideological. And I want to focus on a little bit on care. And I also draw on Parvati Raghuram's article that Katrina mentioned. But Barnett and Land suggests that responsibility and care are useful notions for invigorating and shaping political practice. Post-colonial thinking that centers from that, post-colonial thinking challenges the centers from which that care and responsibility can be talked about. What does care look like for different people from different centers? So drawing on humanism, the contours of care are often presumed and defined by ethical values which masquerade as universal. But post-colonial analysis raises questions surrounding the responsibilities that people in different parts of the world bear to each other and their ability and desire to care for one another. So the concept and practice of solidarity has become ever more elusive in development. Even though there have been demonstrations of solidarity through a host of convivial practices, the refugee crisis has revealed a deep crisis of solidarity. Solidarity is likely to be found amid the mundane rhythms of daily life rather than the mission statement of a global charity. We now need to embed solidaristic discourses and practices as foundational and fundamental to development studies. It's what should make us distinguishable as a field of study. After 3 months of driving through Europe, Shanti and Tara, my parents, decided to see the renowned sights of Egypt. On the 17th of September, 1955, they arrived at Alexandria, Egypt, walking down the gangway of a Lloyd Tristino passenger ship that they'd boarded in Naples. After traveling to Cairo, they drove to Port Said, a distance of about 200 kilometers, to board a cargo ship heading down the Suez Canal to Aden, to Yemen. Always curious, they often diverted off roads, and in this instance, they broke their journey. My partner and I are going to follow the logbook next summer, and we feel it's going to take us even longer because we're going to be diverted off as they were all the time. Always curious, they diverted off, and this time they broke their journey 120 kilometers from Cairo to visit the city of Ismailia, situated on the west bank of the Suez Canal, a city established in 1869 to house the European engineers and laborers who operated the Suez Canal when it was first developed. On the outskirts of Ismailia, they lost their way and suddenly in front of them, a roadblock appeared, and armed men, Egyptian soldiers, commanded that they slow down and stop. The soldiers brandished their guns as they surrounded the vehicle, and with terse instructions demanded that they wind down the windows of their Morris Oxford car. They had entered a militarized zone adjacent to the Suez Canal. Tensions in Egypt had already begun with President Nasser's impending decision to nationalize the canal and thereby control access and accrue revenues for ships passing through the vital waterway, which would eventuate in the notorious Suez Crisis, culminating in the invasion of Egypt by Israeli forces and subsequently British and French bombing campaigns. The hard expressions of the soldiers softened as it became apparent that the travellers, my parents, though their identity was still unclear, posed no danger. Nasser, Tito, Nkrumah, Nehru, or Sukarno, they inquired, reciting the names of the leaders of the then nascent non-aligned movement that had been born in the Asia-Africa Conference held in Bandung in April 1955, the year that they travelled. Upon hearing the reply, Nehru, the soldiers greeted the visitors with broad smiles, pointing and beating their chests and saying, Nasser, Nasser. Like these Egyptians, Tara and Shanti had formerly been subjects of the British Empire, and like them, they'd asserted their right to independence. Nehru, the acknowledged senior statesman, along with Nasser, led the Bandung Conference. At the meeting, Third World leaders shared their problems of resisting the pressures of the major powers, maintaining their independence, and opposing colonialism and neocolonialism, a form of post-colonial solidarity. Their Indian and, importantly, anti-colonial identity confirmed the excitement of the soldiers grew as they noticed my mother's sari. They remarked upon her likeness to the Indian actress Nadira, who played a starring role in the 1952 Bollywood movie Arne. And after a short burst of excitable chatter, they broke out into a hearty rendition of the song Main Rani Hun Raja Ki. Their upright bearing transformed as their boot-clad feet shifted in accompanying approximations of dance moves from the film. Shanti and Tara joined the singing. They had seen the film in India when it was first released and were very familiar with the soundtrack. And Arne had been enormously popular in Egypt and had been watched by millions. After this musical interlude, the soldiers laid down their guns and warned them about the safest route to take to avoid the escalating tensions. In the post-war, post-independence spaces across which Tara and Shanti were moving, new, distinctly post-colonial networks and solidarities were emerging. Their mobile encounters in Egypt catalyzed connections that were emerging prior to their arrival and were reproduced by them. They were made resonant by the shared historical context in which India and Egypt had both been subject to British colonial rule and the independent struggles that successfully eventuated in independent nationhood. They shared a subaltern positionality that they were in the process of transcending. They'd entered a space that was being encompassed by new political and cultural networks, and in which they played a role and found a sense of solidarity, one that we need to reinvigorate, especially in this time of dehumanizing those who are fleeing violence and persecution. And the legacy continues, and that's the Empire Marketing Board Commonwealth poster. Thank you very much.